Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the latest webinar in our Thought Leader series. Today it's called SBTi Net-Zero Standard 2.0, What's New? And I'd like to start by saying a big thank you to everyone for joining us. Brief intro. So today we'll be covering a topic that a lot of you have been waiting on, the SBTi Corporate Net Zero Standard version 2.0. And this is the most significant update to the framework since it launched. And it really changes how companies will set and maintain net zero targets moving forward. And given the mix of sectors represented today, we've got finance, professional services through to local authorities, energy, automotive, life sciences. This update touches almost everyone in the room in the same way. And joining us to walk through it is Oliver Orlik, who is Europe Engagement Manager at SBTi. And Ollie works directly with companies navigating these standards, so really well placed to take us through what's actually changing and what it means in practice. So here's how the session will run. We've got a presentation followed by a Q&A session. And we promise to conclude no later than 12 p.m. The session will start with a short poll to get a sense of where you are on your SBTi journey, and that should help to shape how some of the rest of the material is covered. So I'd encourage everyone to engage with that, please. And from there, Ollie will give a quick overview of SBTi before moving into detail on V2 target setting across scopes 1, 2, and 3, and the implementation hierarchy and phasing under the new standard. So a couple of housekeeping points before we start. The session is being recorded and we'll share the recording afterwards. If you've got questions as we go throughout, please do drop them into the Q&A box at the middle bottom of the screen as opposed to the chat, and we'll put as many of those questions to Ollie as we can at the end. And with that, I'll hand over to Ollie. Ollie, welcome.
Great. Thank you so much. And thanks for inviting me to join here today. I'm Oliver Orlik. I'm the Europe Engagement Manager at SBTi. And in my role, I speak with companies and associations all about science-based targets. And we've just launched the Corporate Net Zero Standard version 2 back in June. So that's the big conversation. And what I'm going to share today is really what that means, what the transition period looks like, how to set targets under Corporate Net Zero Standard version 2. And just to start to say that the most important shift in version 2 is around moving from ambition to action. So on the next slide, just starting with a quick poll to really understand where you are as an organization or people on the call, to learn where your organization is currently at on its SBTi target setting journey. So we have a number of choices from we haven't started yet to we already have targets, or we're looking to understand how to set targets under version 2. So if you can answer that poll, it would be really helpful for me to just get a gauge on the audience, and then hopefully can answer those questions throughout the presentation today, as well as I know we've got 30 minutes, hopefully around 30 minutes at the end to answer your company questions as well. So please do complete that poll and look forward to seeing and reading out those answers. Great. So I can see the poll responses. I don't know if everyone else can, but it looks like we've got a large proportion of organizations who haven't started yet or are looking to understand what SBTi is and assessing what targets mean for them. And then 15% of you have already validated targets, and 13% have validated and approaching the mandatory 5-year review. So we've got a real split on the audience. So I think for all of you, it'll be really helpful to understand what version 2 means, whether that is something that you're going to be approach as you've already set targets, or whether it's something that you're looking at to understand how to set targets for the first time. And the Corporate Net Zero Standard version 2 is really about making an action framework designed to help decision making. So on the next slide, I've got a little bit around the history of SBTi. For those of you unfamiliar with the SBTi, we're called the Science-Based Targets Initiative. We're a corporate climate action organization enabling companies and financial institutions to play their part in contributing to our global climate goals. And we do this by developing standards, tools, and guidance to support companies to set greenhouse gas reduction targets in line with what the science says is needed to keep global warming down and to reach net zero by 2050 at the latest. And we were founded in the run-up to the Paris Agreement as a way for organizations to play their part in helping meet those ambitious net zero 2050 goals. And we were founded by these five organizations at the bottom. And we still work very closely with these organizations to meet and reach companies and associations all around the world. So we've had a huge amount of growth in the past 10 years. So V2 is a result of a lot of our feedback from stakeholders, feedback from companies that have set targets. And it's all about, as I said, moving from ambition to action. This year, we reached 10,000 companies, over 10,000 companies with the validated targets. And most importantly, to do with that is we have a real global spread. So we have, I think, 40% of our companies are based in Europe, and then we have Asia, the US, and LATAM. And most impressively, within those 10,000 companies, they're some of the largest companies around the world. It's also responsible for 40% of global market cap. And that means that these companies have a huge amount of influence. So when they are setting net zero goals, their suppliers then obviously need to align to net zero in order to enable those larger companies to meet their net zero goals. And we're really seeing an expansion of our influence. And this version is all about driving action across every type of organization. So no matter the region, no matter the size, we have updated the standards so that all companies can take part and find solutions to setting targets that work for them. So on the next slide, I'm going to share with you some of the key changes in version 2, and we're going to go through these in more detail. But I just want to pick out the six key innovations. And apologies for those of you who haven't really touched the science-based target standard before, because I'm going to dive straight into the detail of what version 2 means. But given that I've shared that it's about helping companies to set net zero targets aligned to a 2050 net zero trajectory, what we've introduced in version 2 is new tools that help drive that action and catalyze action. So if you aren't aware of version 1, then these innovations are going to be new for you anyway. But the first one is that we're moving towards asking companies to set near-term targets in a 5-year target cycle. So when a company sets a science-based target, it's mandatory for them to set a near-term target, and it's optional for them to set a longer-term net zero target. And this is because we want companies to focus on the key drivers of decarbonization in the near term. And by setting a succession of near-term targets, the company will eventually meet that net zero target. So in version 2, we're moving to a 5-year target cycle. So when you set a target, you're setting a target for what you are going to accomplish in the next 5 years. And this is an update from version 1, which had a 5 to 10-year cycle. We're enhancing credibility. So companies, when they set a science-based target, are also required to develop a transition plan outlining how those targets are going to be implemented, inclusive of key assumptions and dependencies. And this is because we don't want a science-based target to exist as a badge on a company website. We want the action plans to exist behind it. And a transition plan means that it's had the right degree of governance from senior leaders to set out what needs to be done. We're expanding the toolkit. So one of the largest innovations is we're moving beyond a one-size-fits-all approach to an expanded toolkit of different target setting options across all scopes for a different range of levers at companies' disposals. And we're going to touch on that later in the conversation. We know how difficult it is to achieve direct decarbonization in your value chain. And for many organizations, there just aren't the options in the sectors in which they operate or the regions in which they operate. So we're introducing something we're calling the implementation hierarchy, where companies can invest in different decarbonization options further down the value chain, which we will discuss. Sorry, I needed to mute there for a second. And within that, you can leverage different market instruments to meet against the decarbonization targets. So you can leverage EACs to meet against the Scope 2 decarbonization targets. And then finally, we have a new chapter around the role of carbon credits, which is our ongoing emissions responsibility framework, and we can talk about that at the end of the presentation. But it's how we want companies to start to think about what they're going to do in that net zero year. And in the net zero year, companies are required to neutralize all remaining emissions, and that means that they're required to invest in carbon removals or carbon credit options that can remove those emissions from the atmosphere. So the next slide is the question that I get asked the most, which is, what does version 2 mean for me today if I've already got a target? So, or if you're thinking about setting targets. So version 2 we announced in June of this year, and it'll be operational for validations from February the 1st of 2027. And from February the 1st of 2027 through to February the 1st of 2028, companies have an option to set targets under the current standard, which is version 1, or to use version 2. And there might be reasons behind why you want to use version 1. And some of those might be you want to set a near-term target, which is 10 years into the future. Or you might want to use a baseline of data that is more historic, whereas version 2 asks you to set a baseline, which is the most recent set of data. So there might be reasons behind why you might want to choose version 1. But it's important to understand that once you meet your within 5 years of setting your target, you then would have a review with us and be required to move to version 2 eventually. And we see version 2 as being really the next phase of innovation, connected to really how companies can meet against targets. So the target setting options we've outlined there would be more relevant for companies going forward. And then important to note is that the near-term criteria, which currently exists, will be phased out as well from February 1st, 2028, and version 2 will then become the mandatory standard. So on the next slide, I'm going to talk now about the biggest innovation, which is about how do companies set targets for their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions along that net zero 2050 trajectory at the latest. So in the current version 1, companies have an option to set targets of absolute emissions or emissions intensity. And in version 2, we're introducing an asset transition plan. So I'm going to talk through how that works when you're setting targets under version 2. So an absolute emissions target is one where you would set a target to decrease your emissions linearly to reach net zero by 2050 at the latest. So you would set a target in the near term to reduce emissions by 30% in scope 1 by 2030, for example. And in order to meet that, you're going to reduce on a linear trajectory. So it's consistent reduction year on year to meet your 5-year goal. And we're looking to evaluate you on that 5-year goal, not the progress you're making every year. However, that is important for you to meet that net zero and decarbonization target. The second option is emissions intensity. And this is where companies in certain sectors will have emissions intensity pathways, which are consistent with the change that is available within that sector. So we have mapped out through research and studies what a sector decarbonization pathway looks like for a number of sectors. And with that, you can map an intensity pathway that's more consistent to the sector reality. And then the third new method is probably the most innovative, but also the most complex to understand, and that's the asset transition target. So this is really for companies in heavy emission industries where the scope 1 emissions are tied to the assets or the factories that they have within their value chain that emit a lot of scope 1 emissions. And the linear reduction there is unfeasible because they may have a plan to transition away from that asset on a operational plan for 2035, for example. So what the asset transition pathway enables companies to do is to have a pathway that's typically non-linear. It's designed to better reflect how companies actually decarbonize. So it brings together the financial operational plan together with the sustainability plan. And companies would outline their asset transition plan to SBTi and ensure that it's clear how that company is going to meet a long-term net zero 2050 target with the asset transition plan. And then they would reduce their scope 1 emissions and set those scope 1 targets in line with that asset transition plan. I think it's potentially useful here to talk about mobility-wise as an audience. And the key update that I haven't touched is that in version 2, companies are required to set a scope 1 target separate from a scope 2 target. So in the current version, you can combine the targets. In version 2, you have to split the targets out. And that's because we saw companies making a lot of progress on scope 2 decarbonisation, but not moving the needle on scope 1 because scope 2 is typically a larger portion of their footprint. And so to meet the reduction target, they could just focus on scope 2. We are getting closer and closer to that 2050, and we need companies to take responsibility for scope 1. So scope 1 targets must now be set separately. And so this would involve any owned vehicles within your company, and you would need to find ways to reduce those emissions to meet scope 1 targets if that is a key emission category for you. On the next slide, and we will have time at the end for questions because I'm sure many are coming up. And please do use the chat function throughout the presentation to ask those questions because we can cover those at the end. On the next slide is talking about the target setting methods for scope 2. So scope 2 emissions are typically from your electricity use. And version 2 introduces two approaches to set those mandatory near-term targets. So we have the absolute emissions reduction target, which would be to reduce your scope 2 emissions on a linear trajectory to net zero. And we have also the reference pathways for certain sectors, as before. And then we're introducing the low carbon electricity alignment target. So that's to progressively increase the share of qualifying low carbon electricity used, contracted, or matched over time and aligned to net zero pathways. So this would be useful for companies in certain regions where it's difficult for them to procure low carbon energy today. So you could instead focus on procuring more low carbon electricity within your entire inventory in the regions in which you can procure that. And it's also useful for growing organizations because you can continue to emit more and more scope 2 emissions. But if you're moving towards low carbon electricity as a target, you will then steadily decarbonize those overall scope 2 emissions. We have a bit of a safeguard in there, which is if you are expecting to grow your electricity consumption by over 20% a year, you're required to set an absolute emission reduction target because we need those companies to have a long-term view to reducing those emissions. And finally, on scope 3, on the next slide, we have the target setting options here. And this is where there was a huge amount of development in the various drafts that were released. And we'll quickly go through a step-by-step review for what companies need to cover with the target in scope 3 in the existing format of the previous slides. And then on the next slide, which we will talk about how do companies actually set a target using these target setting options. So we go back to the previous slide. So companies have two options. You can set an absolute emission reduction target. So to set a reduced scope 3 emissions by 30% by 2030, for example. Or the intensity target, which is connected to those sectoral reference pathways. And then the other option here is an alignment target. So you can set a target to increase the share of lower carbon and net zero aligned upstream and downstream activities, measured as percentage of spend, revenue, volume, or emissions. And so, for example, you could set a supplier alignment target to have 70% of your tier 1 suppliers to be net zero aligned by 2030. You could set a volume alignment. So you could say 30% of my purchased goods and services will be low carbon options. And this would be useful if you're in an industry, for example, steel, where you could procure green steel. And we will outline which commodities are going to be low carbon or net zero aligned in following guidance. And then you can set a product use alignment to grow the share of the sold products with a lower carbon or net zero aligned use phases. So producing more lower carbon or net zero products as a target. And then finally, a product end of life alignment. So you could set a target to grow the share of products that are designed with circular end of life solutions. So potentially 30% of our products will meet circular standards by 2030. So those are the options. And on the next slide, I'm going to talk through how you would set targets in scope 3. And this is where the largest innovation has taken place. Um, and important to note before diving into that is that Scope 3 emission target setting is only required for the largest companies. So these are our Category A companies, and that it's optional for Category B, and Category B is typically our SME companies. And this is because we want companies to focus on where they can have influence and drive action. The very largest companies are at the top of the top of their supply chain, and they can put pressure on their suppliers to make these things happen because they're a large part of their income streams. Whereas SMEs often have very little influence with the services and products they're purchasing. And so whilst we want them to set scope 3 targets, it's not a requirement because it's very difficult for them to actually meet against reductions until the entire kind of landscape shifts. So how do these companies set targets in scope 3? So the first thing is you are only required to set targets for the categories that represent over 5% of your total scope 3 physical inventory. Um, so this means that we're asking companies to set those targets for the most material scope 3 categories. And this is a change from version 1, where companies are required to set targets for a minimum 67% of their scope 3 emissions. And this is because we want companies to focus on that action and the decarbonization levers that are available to them in the next 5 years. Um, so you set targets, so you identify which of the categories that are over 5% of your total scope 3 inventory. You identify any optional exclusions, and I think useful to hear on this call is employee commuting can be excluded from company target setting. However, if it is a material category for the organization, so if it's over 5% of your total scope 3 physical inventory, it should be included. You can optionally set targets on emissions intensive activities. And then point 4 here is how do you set that target setting approach? So we want companies to select the target setting approach that's best suited to the emission sources and the levers that they have for decarbonization, as well as feasibility for implementation. So at the top of this spider diagram, you have 3 options. The first is you set an overarching absolute emission reduction target. So this would encompass all of your material scope 3 categories, and you set a target to reduce scope 3 emissions by 30% by 2030. And that would be your overarching target. The second option is instead of doing that, you can set an overarching supplier or customer alignment target. So that would be for 30% of your tier 1 suppliers to be net zero aligned by 2030. And then the third option is where you can decide to set a target for each category individually. And different categories have different target options available to them. And these are what's outlined in the below chart. And if you were to go this route, you might have 5 or 6 different individual scope 3 targets, but then you can aggregate them into a single target for communication purposes, which is a question that we've had a lot, which is it's useful for sustainability teams to have these individual targets. It's very helpful for them to take internally as action plans and speak to the procurement teams and the downstream kind of packaging teams around what needs to be accomplished. But actually to communicate something internally can be a challenge. So there is an option to aggregate those into a single target for communication purposes. So everyone in an organization and all of your stakeholders and customers can understand what you're aiming to do. So on the next slide is our new implementation hierarchy. So after setting science-based targets, companies then take action to implement them, which is to decarbonize alongside those targets. And this standard introduces an implementation hierarchy that applies across all 3 scopes, designed to support the long-term decarbonization of the activities and systems that generate companies' emissions. So how does this work? So we want companies to focus on reducing emissions at the activity level. So directly targeting the emissions in their scope 1, 2, and 3 through activities, such as for scope 1, it might be moving like energy efficiency, scope 2, procuring renewable energy or using solar. And then scope 3 is sourcing lower carbon products and services, for example. Once all feasible level activities have been exhausted, the company can then move down to the activity pool or sector level. So this means that if you don't have any more levers at your disposal to reduce those emissions further, you can move to the activity pool level. And this refers to actions that target emission sources within shared systems that companies source from or feed into, such as procuring from an electricity grid, supply shed, or logistics network. An example of an action at the activity pool level would be a company paying for a low carbon shipment on a certain route. The shipping company might not guarantee that the exact ship used will be run with a lower carbon fuel, but that they can guarantee the logistic route is covered by a low carbon project. So that is within the same activity pool, and you as a company are paying for that low carbon shipment route. It's not guaranteed that your one is that, but you're going to get the certification that you have a low carbon project. At the sector level is where you can target emission sources within the relevant market or geography where a company operates or sources from. Um, and this refers to actions such as purchasing market instruments, carrying product attributes from the geographical systemically relevant sources. So to put this into an illustrative example, this might be a company purchasing certificates for low carbon cement. The company is not able to physically procure from a cement plant with carbon capture and storage, so unable to procure low carbon cement due to geographic constraints. They can then purchase cement from the closest available plant and then purchase certificates separately from a plant that's producing cement with CCS. That's at the sector level. And then finally, if there is no feasible options available at activity pool sector level, then there are what that proves there's no feasible options for decarbonisation. So we want companies to invest in enabling actions, which is actions that address the structural constraints to enable future decarbonizations. This would be investing in innovations, for example, and technologies ahead of their delivery of decarbonisation levers. And these wouldn't have any value towards your target progress, but these are really important and required for us to meet against net zero across every single industry and market. The next slide just has some illustrative examples of an activity pool. I talked through the transport shed here, and then we can talk now about energy shed, which is around how can you use these pools to procure electricity from the grid to meet against your decarbonisation target. So on the next slide, I'm going to talk through that. And this is really discussing the new requirements that apply to the use of market instruments for electricity. So how do you use EACs? How do you use RECs in your value chain to decarbonize against those targets that you've set? And we have three clear criteria here, are built around three principles: near, new, and now. So first, looking at near. So this is where deliverability region is outlined. So market instruments are limited to deliverability regions. So we want the electricity that you're procuring from certificates or PPAs to come from the same region in which you are using that electricity. This ensures that electricity is being developed and delivered in the regions where it's required. Next to that is the new. So to strengthen incentives for investment in new clean energy generation. So the previous slide. Market instruments generally need to come from projects that are no more than 15 years old. So you need to procure these market instruments from projects that have a 15-year age limit. So this is procuring from PPAs with new projects. And this will ensure that procurement supports the growth of low carbon electricity capacity rather than simply reallocating the existing supply. And then lastly is the temporal matching piece, the now, which was a really hot topic throughout the development of the standard. And that's specifically hourly matching. So we discussed at length with our expert working groups and stakeholders around hourly matching and wanting to introduce it. Hourly matching is really useful because it enables us to produce the energy at the time it is being used, and also enables better load usage. However, in the final standard, we've gone for a 12-month matching requirement, and that means that companies need to procure the energy market instruments from 12 months from when it is used. But we want companies to move towards hourly matching. We want to incentivize hourly matching. So we're introducing a recognition program. So category A companies need to report the percent of their scope to electricity consumption that is matched on an hourly basis in activity pools. And if those that meet a certain threshold will be recognized on our target dashboard. Um, and this is because we really, really want to incentivize hourly matching going forward. And you will see as well that within the standard, we've also talked about the potential for introducing mandatory hourly matching in the next standard. So this page here is really the additional guidance on how companies can use EACs, electricity attribute certificates, within their value chain to decarbonize in their scope 2 emissions. The next slide sets out our ongoing emissions responsibility framework. So this is looking at the fact that up until that net zero year, companies all around the world are continuing to emit emissions, and those emissions are entering the atmosphere and they're all contributing to global warming. So within the SBTi standard, we set out that at the net zero year, companies need to meet net zero or a neutralization threshold and then invest in carbon removals at that point. We also want to encourage companies to start to take action today. So that's what this responsibility framework does. Phase 1 is the introduction of this program. Phase 2, post 2035, category A companies, so those largest companies, will be required to support an increasing volume of eligible carbon removals. And we've outlined that's going to be 1%, but that may be updated as we get closer to that and new guidance and research comes out. And then phase 3 is for all companies at that net zero target year. They're required to neutralize 100% of the remaining residual emissions across all scopes. So phase 1, this optional recognition program, we are looking to recognize companies that invest in carbon removals or carbon credit projects at 3 different levels. Engaged is if you invest in 1% of your total inventory. In advanced is at 10%, and leadership is 100%. And so companies can earn recognition at these 3 levels by investing in ongoing emissions and carbon credits today. On the next slide is just a little bit more detail about the different approaches that companies can take and more detail around the coverage levels. But just want to outline that we have a couple of eligible approaches. And so there may be questions around what carbon credits will be permitted under this approach or what credits are allowed to be used at that neutralization year. So we've got these 2 approaches, the verified mitigation approach or the contribution budget approach. So companies can identify that 1% of their total inventory and invest in verified mitigation projects that have already delivered outcomes measured in tons of CO2. So that would be investing in carbon credits that have a tonnage or carbon removals. The other option is the contribution budget approach, where a company identifies the amount of tons in that 1% for engaged, and then sets a budget for that. So if your 1% is 100 tons and you set a budget of 20 tons, $20 a ton, then you need to then find $2,000 as your budget. And you can use that budget across a range of different projects, either verified mitigation projects or ex-ante projects. So you can be investing in projects or biodiversity projects that don't yet have verified carbon tons removals. But in that way, we're looking to encourage companies to invest in the projects they're going to deliver in the future. And finally, on the next slide is just to outline that with all of this, there's a lot of criteria that is still being defined. So in the standard, we've outlined the guidance and the resources to follow, but there will be more resources to come. So the launch of V2 standard marks a really clear shift for SBTi as we focus not only on setting ambition, but driving action and maximum impact to accelerate the corporate net zero transition. And in the next month, we'll be launching new resources to support the target setting options for different pathways, which is our methods, metrics, and pathways document, defining our assurance framework, setting out the rules for companies to make claims, and more regarding our interoperability with third-party tools and certification frameworks. So which of those standards and third-party frameworks can be used to meet against those targets, whether it's what are the low carbon commodities that we are aligning to, or what do carbon credits need to, what certifications do they need? So that is everything that I am sharing in this presentation today. I know there's an awful lot to take in, and we have a lot of resources on our website that we can link to after this. And happy now to answer any questions that you might have. So please use that Q&A function, and we'll run through those.
Terrific. Ollie, thank you very much indeed. We've got a lot of questions here. Just before we jump into that, I just want to bring your attention to our next webinar, which we've got coming up. We're really excited to be hosting this on the 5th of August, which is the People's Emergency Briefing, which is a powerful documentary exploring the risks we face from climate change, energy security, food, health, and resilience. And more importantly, it focuses on the practical actions that individuals, communities, organizations can take to respond. And the film features contributors including Chris Packham, Deborah Meaden, Jennifer Saunders, and Lord Devon. And what is especially exciting is that, as far as we're aware, this will be the only online screening of the documentary, making it a really unique opportunity to watch from wherever you are. So if you haven't already registered, I'd really encourage, encourage you to join this one. Anyone who's attended this webinar should have received an invitation by email, but you can go onto the Mobility Ways website under resources, webinar and training, and you can register for that. So quick plug, and we'll move back to today's webinar. So we're into the Q&A, and as I said, we've got quite a few questions for you here, Ollie, and what I've tried to do is group them into some kind of logical flow. So we're going to kind of start with just the structural changes to target setting, and then move through company classification, scopes 1, 2, and 3, and then moving into kind of some around the transition plans. So first question here, which was around the structural changes, was in version 2.0, are short-term and long-term targets no longer separate? Has this been replaced with a single 5-year target cycle? I think you touched on this at the beginning, but if you could touch on that, that would be terrific.
So in the version 2, the near-term target is now fixed at a 5-year cycle, and the net zero target, which I believe the previous long-term target, still remains, but it's not mandatory for companies setting targets. So we want companies to focus on the next 5 years, and then set them and then have that net zero ambition. And I think it's going to be really powerful, as we talk a lot about driving action, is having the opportunity to meet with companies more regularly at that 5-year target cycle means that we can review target progress and also help them identify potential decarbonization levers that might be available to them. And that's a real kind of step change in our strategy, as we've now got over 10,000 companies within our network. We've got some of the key players across all the sectors, and we really see our role as bringing together all that sectoral best practice and supporting companies to see what their sector tools are to benchmark themselves against other competitors or other players, and then understand how to kind of progress. And I think that's probably a good opportunity to talk about. And I don't know whether questions come through, but what happens at that 5-year target review? So once you've set that near-term target, you then meet again with SBTi at 5 years. You complete a questionnaire, and a lot of questions have been coming up around, what have I failed to meet my target? Because as we get closer to 2050 and companies have made all available actions to meet their target, it might be that through operational reasons or through decarbonization lever reasons, they just haven't been able to meet on those targets. And that's where we've introduced something we're calling the best efforts framework, where we want companies to be transparent throughout the near-term target cycle on their progress, and also any challenges that are hindering their progress. And when we get to that near-term target review, we will discuss obviously target progress and the challenges that have stopped them from meeting targets. And we don't intend to remove companies immediately if they haven't met their targets. We want companies to continue on a target setting journey and set the next phase of targets.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ollie. So, another question here. If a company's 5-year mandatory review is coming up soon, should it use the new version at that point?
So there's a little bit of misunderstanding around the role of the mandatory 5-year review. And as we move to version 2, it'll completely simplify and everyone will have a 5-year conversation with SBTi. So the mandatory 5-year review isn't really looking at whether you need to update your target. So if you have your mandatory 5-year review, what that means is you're going to complete a questionnaire from SBTi that checks that your target is still aligned to the climate science to reach net zero by 2050. Um, and you aren't required to update your near-term target if it's in the future. So companies are required to update their target once they meet that target year. So if you have a target for 2030, but your mandatory review is in 2027, in the review, you will complete a questionnaire. SBTi will check that it's still in line, and you can continue on your 2030 target. And then when you get to that 2030 year, that will be when you update your target.
Got you. Okay. Well, there's a question here which I suppose you touched on, but we'll put it to you anyway, which is how companies currently on the V1 will be reviewed once they reach the end of their short-term target achievement period. Will that follow the V2 process?
So we've introduced a transition kind of document which outlines that many of the innovations that we have introduced in V2 can be used and applied to companies that have already set targets under V1. So, for example, the implementation hierarchy and the use of market instruments. A company who's set a target under V1 can apply those market instruments to meet against the decarbonization targets, even though they're in V2.
Great. So moving over to company classification. So we've got a question here, which is what is the criteria to qualify as a category A company? I was wondering if you could perhaps spell out the distinction between category A and B for our audience.
Yes. So a category A company is typically those very largest companies. So the thresholds for that is if they're in any country and they have a net turnover over 450 million euros or FTEs over 1,000. The second category A definition is it's in a high income country, which you've followed the World Bank criteria for, and the UK is one of those, where scope 1 and 2 emissions are over 10,000 tons of CO2, or at least two of the following. The balance sheet is over 25 million euros, the net turnover is over 50 million euros, and FTEs are over 250. And category B companies are any companies that don't meet the category A criteria. So those are in any country, and they aren't essentially large or have a high number of emissions. And
Thank
so,
you very
so
much.
in
Oh,
our current standard, we have an SME route and we have a corporate route. And the SME route is very similar to what we laid out here. They aren't required to set targets under scope 3. And so through the duration of science-based target setting history, we've developed lots and lots of different documents. And in version 2, we're really looking to simplify that and make the process really easy for any company to understand.
terrific. Thank you, Ollie. Okay, so moving over to some questions we've got around scope 1 here. So the first one is what is industries have you benchmarked the emissions intensity percentage targets for scope 1?
So these are typically the high emitting industries. So you can find these on our website under the sector pathways, but we have steel production, cement production, chemicals production, um, shipping, aviation, and buildings.
Okay, brilliant. So, but there's a resource by the sounds of it where it kind of spells out. So anyone looking to find out
Yes.
there, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
And that's the SBCI website
Yes, I can follow up with the links for
with the
all
links.
all the key resources.
Brilliant. So, a follow-up question about scope 1 then. So, is the market-based approach recognized for scopes 1, and scope 3 in V2?
Could you share more or ask, can I get some further clarity on that question? Do you mean market-based emissions?
the market-based approach. So the question is simply, is the market-based approach recognized for scope one and scope three and V2? So perhaps if we'd have a follow-up in the question for a bit more detail, and we'll come back to that and just put a pin in it for now.
Yeah.
We've got some questions on scope two. So for scope two, should companies use, again, market-based or location-based accounting for low carbon electricity?
Um, we would like companies to use location-based, but I think it's up to them. I'll come back to that one and confirm.
We'll come back to that. Absolutely. Okay, so on scope two absolute reduction target using the location-based method,
Yeah.
since location-based only reflects physical grid inventory, how will the use of market instruments be reflected in the value organizations compare against their targets?
That question feels a little bit technical for me to be
Okay,
able to answer. I know that if you have a market-based inventory baseline, you can use location-based market instruments to report reductions against your inventory. And we're following the kind of greenhouse gas protocol guidance on that. But again, yeah, please we'll share that question and I'll come back with a full answer following the webinar.
splendid. Okay, so you talked about deliverability regions in the presentation. So the question following on from that is how that is defined at what perimeter. So given interconnected grids, would Europe as a whole count as a single region?
So that will be defined in later documentation. Um, I believe, I don't know if I should share this because it's not necessarily true, but I believe that we're looking at a market level grid, and so if your operations are in France, you're looking at French-based region. But yeah, that resource will be delivered later this year.
Got you. Okay. So again, perhaps maybe slightly out of scope, but we've had the question through, so I'll put it to you. So this one's around matching low carbon electricity to usage, and the question was, could this disincentivize front of meter LCE generation investment, given the setup costs involved? And it continues to say that where an organization is the developer or owner of the generation asset, should that generation be counted without matching requirements, while still requiring matching where a third party directly uses the energy? So, any
Can you
comments
share
on
that
that?
one over email? Because
Yeah,
yeah, that's
okay.
quite
Okay, so of
yeah,
course, any technical questions on here, we'll put these to Ollie, and Ollie's kindly agreed that we can follow up directly with, uh,
yeah.
yeah, brilliant. So, can companies combine different target setting options for Scope 2 across a global business? For example, some countries following absolute emissions reduction while others follow low carbon electricity alignment?
No, you have to set a target at the company level, but you could set a target across both of those if you wished. So you could set an absolute target and a low carbon electricity target together. But no, there's no regional differentiation, unfortunately.
Thank you. All right, so we're going to move over to scope three now around the target setting options and structure. So for scope three target setting, what options are available? Is supplier engagement still a valid target type?
Yes, so I'll share the presentation after this, but I think there are 4 or 5 different options available dependent on the category, and you can set a supplier alignment target for purchase goods and services and capital goods. So you could still set an overarching supplier target, which is consistent with version one. Where it's not available is if any one of your categories, I don't know, end of life of products is a material category, so it's over 5% of your scope 3 emissions, and that doesn't have a supplier alignment option, for example. So you would need to set a target that at the individual level, or you could set at the absolute emission target as well. So that you have a lot of options available to you, and I think if supplier alignment targets work for all of your key categories, then you could set that supplier alignment target. The support around how to calculate that target when it's across various different categories will come in later resources. So you might be saying, okay, so I want to set a supplier alignment target that's aligned to net zero. What does that mean for each of my individual categories? That will come in later resources.
And you said that you're taking a slightly different approach to scope three and looking at material sources. So the question here was, does the overarching scope three target cascade down to each individual eligible category, or is it a performance assessed against total scope three?
Can you repeat that? Sorry.
So does the overarching scope three target kind of cascade down to each individual category that falls, above 5% materiality, or is it a performance assessed against total scope three?
It would be a performance assessed against total scope three, but that's a very good question, and I'll clarify that in the answer. But we'd be looking at, again, I'm kind of speaking ahead of the resources, but we'll be looking at what's within your scope three material inventory for your near-term target across those. So let's say you've got five categories. What within those five categories makes up that total scope three inventory that's material? And then if you've got a 30% reduction, we'll be looking at 30% reduction on that total inventory. Um,
Got you. Okay. We've got a couple more on scope three, and then we've had a couple through, which I'm going to put to you as well. So the yeah, one more here, which is around the changes to how flag targets are being set.
so there will be an updated flag sector guidance to come, and that will align closer to version 2. And we are kind of in the process of updating the material around all the sector standards to ensure that it's interoperable with version 2. And with flag, so flag is forestry, land, and agricultural. Um, and there are rules around if your flag emissions are greater than, I think it's 20% of your total emissions, then you're required to use that guidance.
Got you. One I had actually for you, Ollie, because I couldn't help notice the reference to commuting there.
Yeah.
And so for categories like commuting, where companies often rely on average-based estimations rather than primary data, does V2's validation process assess the accuracy or quality of the measurement approach itself, or is materiality assessed purely on the reported percentage, kind of regardless of how that figure was calculated?
Good question. No, so we don't have the kind of we aren't going to be reviewing the quality of the data. What we see, obviously, we want companies and category A companies are required to get external assurance on the data. What we see is that companies looking to set targets are prioritizing sustainability within their strategy. And if you're setting a net zero target, you obviously need to put in place the levers to meet that. And that's where getting stronger data is really crucial to ensuring that you are acting on the facts. So with every company on their GHG journey, it starts with spend based and then moves down to activity based. So if employee commuting does become a material category for that organization, then the greater the data, the best opportunity to create the tools or the decarbonization options that can support the category.
Got you. Thank you. So, got a few more now. So, the one here was just around existing targets, review timing, and the SME pathway. So, the question is, do we need to set a new baseline for emissions every 5 years?
Yes. So when you set targets under version 2, you are required to choose a new baseline from the previous 2 years of the previous two reporting years. And that's because you will always, wherever you are, you're on a net zero trajectory to get to net zero by 2050. And so by asking you to set a target on the latest data, you're therefore setting a target on what you're actually going to act against. So in version 1, you could set a historic target, and though lots of companies will say, I want to maintain my historic target because I've already done so much. And we don't disagree. Companies can continue to report uh, in their communications their progress against a historic baseline. But when it comes to making progress against their decarbonization journey, they as SBTi, we want companies to focus on where they actually need to act today. And so by focusing on the latest inventory, we can identify where those emission hotspots are, identify those scope 3 material categories, and then companies then can develop the action plans that are against that. And I think that is part of the stronger, I suppose, assurance around when companies set targets, we want them to act against them. And for if we're asking if companies are using a historic baseline that is wildly different from where they are today, then they could say they've made progress without actually making any progress.
Got you. Okay, so an example question here, which is so my company has validated targets set in 2023 with a 2030 near-term target date. When do I need to set targets under the new standard?
So if you have set targets in 2023, your mandatory 5-year review will be in 2028. Within our mandatory 5-year review framework, if your near-term date is within 2 years of the scheduled mandatory 5-year review, you can request a waiver. So this organization can request a waiver from the mandatory 5-year review, so they wouldn't have to do that. And then when they meet their near-term target year in 2030, that's when they would be required to set a new near-term target.
Question around SMEs then. So what's happened with the SME target setting route? How do SMEs set targets?
So this is again, I suppose, touching on the category A and category B company routes. So it still exists. We've just simplified our resources so that all companies use the same standard and same set of tools to set targets. And we will be launching more like target setting tool support on the V2 on the validation site to ensure that SMEs understand exactly how to set targets and what it entails for them. So yeah, it hasn't gone away. It's just been put in this one single standard.
Got you. All right. So we're going to just move over. We've got a few questions around the transition plan and the implementation hierarchy now. So one of the questions here is the implementation hierarchy relevant to the transition plan? So do companies need to consider all four levels of action and define actions for each?
So the implementation hierarchy is not quite the right reading of it. The implementation hierarchy is really what are the options that a company can use to decarbonize in scope 1, 2, and 3. So we're not asking them to use all four. We're asking them to focus first on their value chain and the levers that are at their disposal. And then once they can't find any more levers there, they move down into the activity pool level. And then once those are all exhausted, they move down into the sector level. And then once those are all exhausted, they're saying that there isn't really a decarbonization option available in their region. So we're asking them to then invest in technology, innovation, support, research that can lead to that decarbonization. So it's not invest in all of them. It's work through it and move down it as required in order to decarbonize.
Okay, brilliant. And a follow-up question is around the boundary between the activity pool and sector level action. Why wouldn't buying low carbon cement, say, fall into the activity pool?
Uh, I think that example there that I shared was around the region. So the activity pool is looking at the within the same kind of market or region of where you're procuring from. Whereas the sector, the cement example I think I shared was that there isn't any low carbon cement available within the region. So you're procuring certificates from a region in which you can procure those certificates and still sourcing your cement from the region in which you need it. So the activity pool level is really around ensuring that the required resources available in the market in which it's actually being used.
I think we've got time for one more, and it looks like it should be quite a quick one, Ollie. So this is around certification and professional development. So when will the course for decarbonisation professionals, based on the updated standard, be available on the SBTi website? Because somebody here would like to obtain certification under the updated standard.
I don't know the answer to this. I'm really
Okay.
sorry. I'll come back on that one. I would hope it would be midway through next year. and hopefully before, but I will confirm on that. A lot of the work that we're doing now is around getting the teams ready for the influx of companies to do V2. And I know that it's going to be hugely important to have consultants available for companies to use in order to set targets onto V2. So I would hope it's in advance of that February the 1st, 2027, but I will have to confirm.
Fabulous. Um, we've still got loads of questions, but we have unfortunately reached 12 o'clock, which is our cutoff point. So we're going to have to end the session now. That just leaves me to say thank you ever so much to Ollie Orkin of the SBTi for sharing your time and knowledge with us today. Once again, this recording and the slides will be shared with everybody, and any questions that we weren't able to get through, we're going to get those over to Ollie, and we'll follow up by email on any unanswered questions. Thanks again for joining all of you, our audience. Trust it was insightful and you got what you needed. If there's anything you want to watch back, then please check out our YouTube channel later today, where this will be posted alongside all of our other webinars in the Thought Leader series. So thanks again. Enjoy the rest of your day and farewell.
Thank you.